Welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez, thanking you for joining me again with what is a fantastic series of discussions with leaders across Australia and across different industry sectors. And today, a beautiful Wednesday morning in Brisbane to be talking to another great leader. And I want to give you a background to my guest today. So my guest is the founder and CEO of Team Women Australia. She has also had roles with as a senior consultant with the Performance Code, and has also been a senior consultant with Trinity P3 Global Marketing Management Consultant. So can I welcome Kylie Fitzpatrick to the podcast? How are you, Kylie?
Yeah, really great. Thanks for having me.
Mate, it's a pleasure, and thank you for your time. So once again, like with all the podcasts, I'll start on question one. In which industry did you get your opportunity to have your first leadership role, and why did you take it on?
Well, that was media. So my first movement into leadership was in strategy, and was an advertising strategy manager role. And I had got to the point in my career where I was looking just for the next thing. And at that point, I think I'd been maybe 7 or 8 years. I'd been in, I'm in a technical role and solid amount of experience in doing what I was doing. And I got a phone call up, actually, is what actually happened. And because I was working in magazines at the time, and I got a call from the lady who said, "Oh, look, I've been recommended to you by somebody that you know from previously working here." So I started my career working at News Corp and as an analyst and a researcher. And I moved down to Sydney, and I took a job with the company, and I quickly found that, it wasn't really fulfilling my own passion. So I moved into the magazine space, but I got a call back from the guy that I'd previously worked at News Corp, saying, we want you to come in and take a look at this role. And it was for a leadership position. Mind you, may I call it probably more managerial position, where I had a staff of 7 people. And I thought, well, it's time. It's just time.
Oh, okay. So, and thank you for sharing that, because there's been a mix of how the leaders that I've had the good fortune to be speaking to have said they've got there, and some were tapped on the shoulder and some sorted. So did you enjoy that first role, even though, like you're saying, it wasn't strictly a leadership role, but did you learn some stuff in that role that helped you for future positions?
Oh, gotcha. I learned a lot. And I learned a lot mostly from recognizing and hitting those things that didn't work. I think you realize what you're really capable of when you learn what doesn't work. I had walked into a role where there was other people in that team who had also applied for the role. So one of the first things that was the biggest challenge for me was to manage an individual who really wanted that job. And that in itself was a challenge. So, walk straight and go, well, wow. You don't walk into an environment where it's all great. No, you're walking into an environment where you've got some complexity, and that was really, really difficult. And, look, unfortunately, it wasn't a great, she was really great at campaigning for herself with other people in the business, and it made it very challenging for me to try to work with her one-on-one. So, I had to find ways around that. I had to find ways to enable another person to, really thrive in their job, give them the freedom and the space to do their job, without feeling like she was kind of being looked over, And I have to tell you, I think that was probably the first real sense that I didn't know it at the time. But if I look back, I think that was probably the biggest distinction between leadership and management, because, in some respects, I'm there managing a team and managing output, but I wasn't managing her. She was really demonstrating her own capability, and it was like, well, how do I work here to empower her and, also give her some of my own expertise without her feeling like I'm, managing her.
Yeah. Kylie, you've done what all the great podcast guests do, and you've answered my next question around.
Oh, have I?
Yeah. So the difference between leadership and management. So that's quite a telling example, in that you took a role where, going in, someone on the team or several people on a team have also expressed an interest in the role that you've gotten. So, was that the first time that you had that sort of in your face that you had to deal with in terms of managing people, and that some of your staff were wanting the role that you had? So was it always difficult, or was it something that smoothed out over time? Like what approach did you take to trying to make it less of an issue, if I can use that terminology?
Well, I think one of the greatest lessons now looking back, and it is a bit of a mantra now for myself, is that, you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make them drink. And which is why my opinion very much about leadership is that the expression of leadership really happens when you're, not forcing or controlling the circumstances around you. And I think, I could say, well, I failed at being effective in that space with her, because what ended up happening was she left for another role. So it wasn't satisfactory for her. In the same voice, I think, I tried to do everything I possibly could to acknowledge her. I think I focused on what I could do to recognize her and her efforts by putting her on projects that kind of validated her more seniority, putting her on teams where she was able to liaise independently and have an autonomy with other managers in the business. So I really looked for opportunities where she could just thrive without me, and that would give her, an equal voice. But in saying that, I think she ultimately was looking for the opportunity to manage other staff, and she eventually left.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately that can happen, but it's not. So it's never a reflection, I think, on the person taking the role, because you didn't make the decision to offer the role to your. It was a competitive process, and what happened. So sometimes people, unfortunately, just either have to. And I'm talking from an employee point of view, because I've been in that position myself. You either suck it up or you do something else, because human beings, being what they are, will always have that grating on them that I've just missed out, and it's something you can't just completely forget out or tune out of your brain, particularly if it's something that you wanted. So it was interesting that you did what you could, and the person still ended up leaving the role, which can happen. And I don't think it's a reflection on the leader so much. It's
no, it's definitely not. And if I can add a different perspective, I had a client recently who, similar situation. She went for a role, and somebody else in her team went for the role, and the other person got the role. And her manager had suggested to her that she was welcome to continue reporting into her. To elevate her and give her the confidence that she was equally competent. And, I think the background for me in my own personal experience in doing that, gave me enormous insight in how to actually empower her. And I said, here's my advice. I don't recommend you do that, because as you have the ability to empower that person who's got that job just as much as anybody else. And I said, and it's not going to empower that guy who's now got that job if you're all of a sudden reporting into the same boss, but you don't have the title. So she was miraculously, what she did is she went and acknowledged this guy for getting the job, and, said that she had a lot of learnings herself about the role and what they could do to work together as a team. And I thought, that's just brilliant, because the thing that I really value about what she did is that she's demonstrating that leadership doesn't come down to just having the title. Leadership comes down to your ability to express yourself as a leader, regardless of those things.
I find myself agreeing, nodding. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Mm-hmm. So let's and I'm trying not to stick on too much of a negative here, but I do need to ask the following couple of questions. So and then all these are based on your experience, obviously. So leaders sometimes make mistakes. How do you typically engage with an error or mistake that's attributed to you as a leader, Kylie?
Do you want the honest answer?
Yes, please. That would be good. That would be nice. Yeah.
So, look, I think the first thing to say is my commitment with leadership is that anyone really sees themselves as, anyone can be a leader, really, and so there are two ways that I look at that. Firstly is I am a human being like anybody else. And, I have a default with failure. I don't like failing. I get really hard on myself. Now, if I look at my experience over time, especially when I was a new leader, I was really, really hard on myself. In fact, there were mostly I wouldn't do anything unless I thought I could win at something. And then if I didn't think I could win at something, I'll tell you, I would, my approach to study is a perfect example, because I'd stay up all night. I'd buy bottles of Coke and chocolate, I would literally give it everything so that I would win. So I think that tells you a lot about my default around failure. I just don't like losing. Let's just face it, right? So as a human being, my automatic reaction is to be annoyed and angry and upset with myself, and and then go hardcore on how I was going to get out of that failure. But the greatest lessons I have learned in my career have definitely been where those reactions and the failures have given me insight about things. I'm proud to now say, even though, of course I have a natural inclination when things don't go well, and, I still have the automatic brain wiring that doesn't like failure, but, I've done a lot of work now in being able to slow my pace down, so that I am more mindful of how I'm not only approaching it, but being willing to take on more areas where failure is definitely a certainty. I would never have considered myself in the past an entrepreneur, and I spent 23 years in the safety and comfort of a corporate environment, and it really wasn't until I exited out that I really had to confront, well, I need a different view about failure here, because every day I could wake up and go, what, I'm failing. I could really look at it like this is a failure.
Can I unpack that a little bit, because you're the other entrepreneurs that I've had on the podcast that have talked about this have said that they either had a natural appetite for risk and the potential to fail, because with a risk there's always that potential. But hearing you speak about this, if you didn't make that conscious change, it would have been very, very difficult to move out of a corporate environment, because necessarily when you're out on your own, there's an assumption that you have to take some risks to do what you do as an entrepreneur. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Eric, it really did come down to my thoughts about it. I could easily say absolutely it takes a new view about failure to exit out of what we deem to be a safe environment, right? The thing that did shift for me, though, was recognizing that was just all an illusion in itself, because realistically, no one's ever safe. Ever. Even if you think you're safe in a corporate career, in an environment that's going through a lot of change, particularly these days, is really an illusion, because everyone's at risk.
Yeah, and that's a hard lesson to carry around in your mind, is that it's almost and this is my view, so I'm not gonna put words in your mouth, obviously, but for me, it's no one is indispensable or not replaceable. So things can happen, organizations can shift focus, you could lose a job from one day to the next, and you could find yourself facing the reality that you have to do something different or apply for another job, and that's always there. But I think people put up a wall and say, well, I'm here now, so I'm safe.
Yeah.
Once you sort of achieved whatever role you're going for, you think you're safe at that next level. And I'm not saying everyone in their roles that might be listening to the podcast are not don't have secure employment, but things can change sometimes, and I guess it's a mark of how much you can deal with change if something does blow up or something does change out of left field. Do you have the resilience to deal with it? Is probably the best way to put that. And it sounds like you had to build that up for yourself in taking on an entrepreneurial role, which again is good to hear, because if these podcasts do anything, is to provide examples to people that you can go out and do some of this stuff, but you have to be prepared to where some things not working and sort of learn from those failures and risks that you've taken. Is that some
yeah,
of the
absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say that about any area of life, that no matter where you look, if there's anything that doesn't work, or any area where you fail at something, You know, we do have all the reasons why not, and we can look at them and just go, oh, well, that's because of, you know, whatever the reason. But I always now look from, okay, yeah, they're the reasons. Okay, so what is interesting about those particular reasons? Because if we actually take a look at the reasons why we failed, that usually gives us a very good insight into some very clear lessons that can propel us forward. And I make the same mistakes many times over. You know, like I've run workshops before, and, you know, I have an opinion about whether I think it measured up against my own standards of performance. And I'd go, oh, well, that was a failure in terms of my view, because I didn't quite hit the financial target. I didn't quite hit the, you know, the engagement that I wanted to. And I could go, well, that's a failure, right? Now, it empowers me to say it's a failure in my standards because the game I was playing was at this level and I didn't meet that. Okay, great. So if it's a failure according to those standards, what was the reason why I didn't actually produce the result I said I would produce? Now, I never did that before. But now I've learned that actually, if I have a commitment to something and I don't produce the result, it's not like failure is bad. If I acknowledge it as a failure according to my standards, then I've got somewhere to go look for what's missing. So, you know, I did do workshops like that. And what I learned was actually go list all the things. And I did do that, you know, list all the things that actually really worked about it. Then look at what are all the things that didn't work about it and go, okay, Craig, what can you do about the things that were missing? Are they things that you can now go and impact? And I think whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're in business, or whether, you know, no matter what you do as a parent or anything, if you can list out those things that are the reasons why you did not produce what you said you would, you can actually go do something about that.
God, parents failing? No, us parents, no, we never fail. It's we've learned from our past, and everything we do is perfect. And I understand what you're saying, and it takes some time, and it's difficult for some people to do that. I know being introspective to the degree that you're talking about is not easy for some people to do, because if you unpack it enough, it can lead to some uncomfortable truth about how you look at some things or how you organize yourself in the world. And I'm not saying that as to catastrophize. I think it's just a reality that some people can deal with that unpacking better than others. And if I've learned anything in my travels, in the leadership roles that I've had and the current role that I'm in, I think if you don't do that, you're never going to get better at what you're doing. You'll always maintain a level. And constant self-improvement is necessarily a good thing, because at some point you need to ask yourself some searching questions. And if that puts you off your game a bit, it means something needs to be looked at or something needs to be changed. And I think that's necessarily a good thing without having to pay psychologists or psychiatrist fees to do that. So if you can do that on your own, you save yourself a fair bit of dollars in the process. So look, Kylie, can I ask another question about this leadership journey that you've been on? What's the most difficult part about being a leader for you?
I would say how to mobilize other people towards the fulfillment of the future you're trying to create. So I guess to contextualize how I would describe leadership is that for me, leadership is about you have a vision of creating a new future of some sort. You know, however you want to create that, you call it a purpose, a goal, an outcome, business objectives, whatever that looks like. A new view of how you want to create a community, or you have a vision for what's possible of something. And then your job as a leader is to mobilize others to fulfill on that future. Because leadership is not, you don't produce that alone. We're not kind of out there charging out like some maverick. No, a leader is somebody who fulfills on that future by being able to mobilize people towards that future. That's my view anyway. And so in that context, I'd say the most difficult thing is how to have people align in a way that they embrace it, they own it as much as you own it, and that they can then be independently expressing themselves as a leader without necessarily feeling like they need the title or some accolade, and to remove that requirement out of the mix, so that they actually do really get to experience themselves as a leader.
Sure. Okay. And before we spoke and we talked a week ago about this idea of chasing a title or chasing a position is not necessarily the thing that's going to fulfill you. And there are a lot of people that I think we've both met in our travels that are great leaders but don't have that title. So it's never about the title, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in the quickest way possible. So Kylie, how do you measure success as a leader?
So always by results, that's for sure. And the fulfillment of results, it's certainly one thing. But the other is I guess I'm reminded of a quote by Maya about, no one will remember what you did or what you said, but they will definitely remember how you made them feel. And great leadership is absolutely by cause of results. But I think if we only need to look at somebody like, Gandhi or, Martin Luther King as a leader, in their time, they didn't produce the result that they were out to commit because it was a bigger future. So there are definitely results. And I think, being able to create milestones that has people experience success, like success really is going to come down to my experience of whether I produce a result. I watch my kids and they play football. Of course they want to win, right? Success is about having the experience that we win. So there's definitely the results side of success and making sure people have the experience of winning, which is why I always make sure there are very incremental goals for people, because if you give them the experience of success, they're more likely to breed success. But after that, I do think it is about the experience that you create for people. Like, it's no good for you to be hardcore at success if you underneath are dealing with, an epidemic of stress and unhealthiness and bad relationships and toxic conversations. And, if that's not there, then I'm sorry. I don't care how successful you are in producing results and making money and doing all those things. If you're not creating an environment where there are people that are thriving, being a contribution, experiencing contribution, and have great relationships, and have great health, then none of it matters, in my opinion.
You bring up something that's been brought up consistently through the podcast, is that creating an environment that fosters development of your people. So I guess there's two outcomes that come from that. If others are being successful and are allowed to make mistakes, and you're not at them for everything that they do, and you're trusting their professional judgment, that creates for very good work spaces, and also helps you to grow as a leader as well, because you'll find people will self-disclose and go that extra mile without having to be asked to do that in their role, because they like what they do and they want to be at work. That's not for everybody, and I'm not being naive when I say this, that some people go to work because it gets a paycheck and they go home, and that's as fulfilled as they get, and that's fine. But there's others that go to work because it's something they really want to do and they get a buzz out of doing it. So having to manage that spectrum of people is an interesting thing. And from what I hear you saying is that you need to provide an environment for those people to thrive as much as they can whilst achieving results. So you don't want to make it, you don't go to work to have fun necessarily. You're there to do a job, but you don't have to make it such a toxic place to go that people turn up and they don't produce. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think despite the fact that everybody's different, and I think this is the thing where I do value diversity, but my fundamental view is, as a human being, whether or not we say, we go to work for a particular reason, or we don't want to go and have fun, I operate from the premise that everybody inherently wants to live their life as a contribution, and everyone inherently wants to have the experience of making a difference. I just take that as a given. So therefore, I'm always interested in what does that actually look like for the individual, because it's that although everyone does want to have the experience of being connected and being a contribution and making, look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? One of the basic foundations is the need for belonging. So I take that as a given for everybody. As for what that looks like for the individual, that's where I do really believe that great leadership is about how do you elicit those things so that people do get the experience of expressing their own self-expression as a leader, and their own contribution and their own talent and their own strengths, because that's when we can really capitalize on greater results, by making sure that they feel like those things are being heard.
Look, Kylie, I've got a couple of statements here that I'd like to get your perspective on, if I could. The first one being, on-the-job experience develops better leaders.
Yes, I would agree. And I read an article on the fourth generation revolution about three things that we need to think about as we go into this new world. And it was the combination of education, employment, and entrepreneurship. And I thought this is brilliant, because you can be a great entrepreneur, right, and have lots of fabulous ideas, but without either some level of education or some level of employment, it's very difficult to get traction successfully on the ideas that you've got. So there's absolute value in all three of those domains. And on-the-job experience is where you get to really discover what you're capable of. See, you can have all the theory in the world. Like, I can tell you, in my brain, my ideas, I'm fabulous. I'm just like, yeah, I can handle this, no problem. But then you stick me in the arena, the Teddy Roosevelt, get in the arena, and then you're confronted with you're like, wow, right, well, I had great intentions of this going this way, and it didn't show up that way.
Yeah, okay. There's some examples that come into mind of we talk about on-the-job experience, and I think as time goes on, and as I'm getting older, I'm more in that camp now, that there's certain things that you get from experience in work, whatever that is, that only comes through time served in a role. And I'm
absolutely.
I'm definitely not a mandated. I don't mandate in my own mind, let alone to other people, that unless you've got a million years experience in a job, you can't be a leader. But I think that there's some things that you learn in your travels when you talk to other leaders. So one thing I often tell people that ever ask me the question, what do you look for in the leaders that you've worked for? I try and talk to who I believe are better leaders than myself for whatever metric I use in my own mind, and to just ask them questions of why do you do what you do and why did you do that? And you'll find that if you get people talking, even if you're not in a leadership role yourself, decent people will say, look, the reason I did make the decision was this, this, and this. And if you can unpack how people make some of those decisions, you get to see the more human side of the people that you're working with and for.
That's right.
And it takes a little time, because you've got to create relationships, and you have to have a degree of trust.
That's right. Look, I think there's one reason, Eric, that job experience is, and I call it job experience, whether it's years of experience is not so much the case, but at least some level it creates compassion. So if I'm giving my, experience, I've got some compassion about knowing exactly what it takes to do something. Whereas if I put it this way, I don't take advice or leadership from anyone who hasn't actually traveled the journey themselves. I'm like, you can tell me that, and that's really great, but I'm sorry, unless you've actually done it for yourself, how do I even know? Now, that it could be considered arrogant, and you know what? It takes arrogance to be a leader. Let's just face it, right? It takes having some kind of, resoluteness that, I know what I'm up to. But
that's nuanced, Kylie. I think there's some nuance there, and I really appreciate you saying that. I think that what you've just said there is nuance. So I'll use my experience as an example. I've been in CEO roles and upper management roles for the last 10 years in the same industry sector, and so I can speak to and walk that walk with colleagues in a similar role. But if I talk to yourself as an entrepreneur or others that are entrepreneurs, that to me is a completely different world, because I've never taken the risk that you guys have of going out there, hanging up your own shingle and doing it for yourself. So I can relate to some of what your experiences are, but I can't ever say, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've done it, because I haven't. And I think to some degree, working for corporates or working for not-for-profits, whatever the sector you're in, when you're working in an organization, you've got a degree of shelteredness that provides you some comfort. Once you leave that to do it for yourself, it's a very different space to play. That's only my view. Have you found that in your travels with the leaders that you've spoken to, that depending on whether they're entrepreneurial in that sense or whether they're working for a corporate, that they've got slightly different lenses on that world of work?
Actually, no.
Okay. All right.
It's not, no, mostly because what I've discovered is that great leadership comes down to the attributes that are consistent, despite whether they're in an organisation, whether they're out. Because if we looked at that lens, I think, it's very easy to, I mean, you only need to look at the banking sector at the moment, right? There is a lack of confidence at the moment in the leadership in that industry because of some of the behaviours. So one would say, well, that's not great leadership. But if you look inherently at that great leadership comes with a similar set of attributes, whether you're in that environment or whether you're as an entrepreneur. And if you speak to any leader in a corporate organisation who is doing a great job as a leader, I can guarantee you they wouldn't be that different to those that are out in the entrepreneur. Sure, they're taking risks outside the environment, but so are those people in the corporate environment. They're taking just as much risk as they are outside. But I think for me, that comes down to my view that leadership is inherently about who we are as a human being and our commitment to creating a new future and our ability to mobilise other people around us. So, if you can do that there, you can do it anywhere, is what I would say.
Brilliant, brilliant. So as a follow-up to that last statement, here's the mirror statement to it. Formal education helps to develop better leaders.
I definitely think education does. I think there is a place, absolutely, in great leadership comes from knowledge. I think the paradox is it's not the education that makes you a great leader, but it is an anchor on great leadership. That was a very short answer. Do you want a longer one?
No. I'm just.
I think though we can be mistaken. Thinking back to the question you said even about job experience. I do think that it's multidimensional, and education is absolutely an anchor on providing knowledge, on being able to implement things, and it's in the background. And then there's, a job experience that gives you on the court experience of being able to make things happen. And I do think it's a combination of having that in the background. I just think it's an illusion if we think that going and getting more credentials is actually going to elicit leadership in our experience as a great leader, because it's not the thing that actually has that happen. Right. Yeah, look, I suppose if I was to say it pretty bluntly, you can have all the tools in your toolbox and the frameworks and the methodologies and the models and the textbook theories and the thing, but you throw that out to a human being and I tell you, you lose them. Okay. You lose people. And leadership is about people. It's not about textbook theory. Now, I'm not saying it's not valuable, because I've done a stack of study. I've done postgrad studies. I'm a researcher, so I've spent years in research and practical knowledge and education around neuroscience. And I'm not saying don't do that, because it gives you insight, it gives you things. But when it comes to playing the game of being a leader and you're out there and impacting people, you lose people the second you want to start getting all academic or theoretical or, let's use this framework. I mean, I think it's something we need to be very mindful of.
Sure. Last statement. Leaders are born, not made.
Bullshit.
Wow.
I am a big advocate in the world of paradox. And if we start believing that, what hope have we got for every human being who actually has an extraordinary amount of talent who may not perceive them to be a born leader? That's just bullshit. That's the first thing I would say. Now, in saying that, I think we do need to actually accept that every single person is born a leader. Because I just need to look at my son. Perfect example. I was watching my son when he was 10 years old. He's now 12. Playing football, and he's a very quiet guy, quiet achiever, introvert, loves to study. He's not the big vocal one, right? But he's out there playing football, and I'm watching the game, and he is, he's instructing where saying to his mate, out there, move out there, like he's leading the team. And I thought to myself, listen, he's never been to university. He doesn't have postgrad studies or a PhD. Or was he really born a leader? Well, if anyone looks at him and has some description about what a leader looks like, you'd go, well, he's not a born leader. But I tell you, that kid right in that moment, I had to video record it. I went, that is leadership. That is true leadership right there. So I'm just I call bullshit on that statement. Sorry.
Okay, no. And so for the benefit of the leaders listening to this and those that aren't in leadership roles listening to this, that was Kylie's view of the statement, leaders are born, not made, and it's probably the most colourful response to that statement that I've had. Look, and you see it around you all the time with the official title. So the kid playing sport, like what you're saying with your son, I've seen it with my sons out on the field. You take those roles when you have to, and you don't when you don't. So
really, anybody can be turned into a leader. And I've spent a good amount of time facilitating programs, specifically called self-expression and leadership, to a broad market of people. Diversity from people who would never consider themselves a leader. And I can tell you, I have seen people transform and creating miracles when they actually when they remove some of their own obstacles to their view of leadership. And when they do that, I tell you, anyone, and when you've seen it, you will go, absolutely, anyone can be a leader, and whether we take the role or not. I'm very passionate about this for one reason in particular. There are global studies now telling us that we have a leadership crisis. And people are not advancing as leaders, and there's a threat to leadership. Our view of leadership and how we treat leaders and our own stifleness about leadership itself. There was a study done that highlighted, 88% of leaders said they're doing a great job as a leader, except on the flip side, you had something like 78% of leaders who were saying, well, no, the leader's not doing a great job. So we've got a big disconnect in that space. And that's because there's this tension in being able to have people view themselves in the capacity of being able to express leadership, despite whether they've got the title, or despite whether they think they're born with it, or despite any of that stuff. And I think we have to remove that obstacle in order to allow people to show up as leaders.
Wow, okay. I'm going to have to come along to one of these courses you hold to have you listen talk about this stuff, because leaders, let alone great leaders, are more facilitators of information or knowledge. And I think, no, you're a very good leader. It's just that you don't peg yourself with the title. And if you accept the premise that the world of work is about managing relationships and people, then maybe the discussion needs to go in a very different direction. And it'll take some time, because unfortunately, whether I like it or not, or whether you like it or not, there are some people that will chase the title and want to have it known to the world, hey, I'm the boss, and this is it.
That's right.
And that's just the world.
Well, that's the model we live in. Let's just face
correct.
It. That is the model that we have grown up in, and in our generation, and even today. This is why this evolution, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, it really was that the construct of leadership was all about, in a hierarchical model. And so therefore, in the current environment, that is the way it currently is. So of course it will take time to shift that. And we have to acknowledge that is the way it is as our access to causing the transformation. Yeah,
no, agreed. So Kylie, look, this is the bit in the podcast where I want to share some stuff that I'm doing in my own study. So I'm hopefully graduating next year, and I'm looking at leadership development, and in particular in the ag sector, that there are two core capabilities that leaders need to demonstrate or have, I guess, at least from the literature point of view, and it's something that I'm exploring in my studies, is that strategic thinking and foresight are going to be critical leadership capabilities for future leaders in the ag sector. So I just wanted to get your perspective on what you think of strategic thinking and foresight as leader capabilities.
Definitely think they are part of it, part of the mix, for sure. And I guess if I anchor on what I was saying, my own personal definition of leadership is people who do have a vision of a new future, or a future being possible, to mobilise people towards that future. And in that case, that does take strategic thought. It doesn't necessarily, it requires, there's a very fine line for me between strategic thinking and creativity, because creativity also elicits a new view of a future. And one would say, is it either all strategic thinking or creative? I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I think there's there's an intersection between the two. But I definitely think if you're going to mobilize people towards something, the value of strategic thinking is it means that you can actually have them focused on the actions that specifically get you to that new future. Without strategic thinking, you're all over the shop, right? You're just doing action everywhere.
Without some degree of coordination. Yeah.
That's right. But that's strategic, right? Strategic is having a very clear view about the actions are aligned to a particular outcome. Yep. And then the foresight, well, 100%, that being a leader is about being willing to act before others act, being able to think before others think, and being able to really mobilize an action before others take action. Having the courage to do that. So absolutely a necessity, I would say.
Yeah. So and I think I could do research forever around the link between the degree of how much a person uses foresight and a specific group in our society. So the entrepreneurs amongst us that I think they're looking to the future always to see, well, what can I do different? How can I, what's the word? In the technology, in the technology field or in any field, how can I be a disruptor, or does something need to be disrupted? And so you find that it's the entrepreneurial types amongst us that see those futures in a different way to the average person. But that's not to say that every person doesn't have the capacity to be to use foresight, because it's part of how we think. Is part of our cognitions. It's like strategic thinking. We all do it to differing degrees. It's how much you then apply it to the world of work or to the world of volunteering or whatever it is that you do for a living. So yeah, no, I would agree with you on that.
Well, the neuroscience does tell us that the brain, what makes a human being distinct from anyone else is that our brain is wired for it. We can imagine a future. Every single one of us can imagine a future. Therefore, it makes it possible, whereas that doesn't exist in a lot of other animals. So in the design of our brain, absolutely, it's a fundamental thing that a human being can do. And again, you're right. If it's the degree to how much you use it, and there was I'm pretty sure a psychologist who had the famous view that we're either anchoring towards a future or we're focused on the past. And any one of us at any point in time can either think about the future or we can behave from the past. So it's just being able to recognize which one we're doing and to then turn our attention to get back into creating a future that creates the practice, which is why I'm of the opinion that anyone can be a leader. Because if you just keep focusing on the future instead of anchoring on the past, then you're practicing the game called have foresight and take an action going forward.
Right. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Kylie, here's the final question, and I hope you don't get as animated as you did before with the more not made question, but here it is. So what might you say to a younger version of yourself about being an effective leader?
Yeah, good one. Very simple. Back yourself, always. Well, back yourself and trust yourself. I think they're the two things that go hand in hand. But the thing that very clearly is, the reason I say back yourself is because you got to recognize that we live in this world to make a difference to others. And rather than put your attention out there on others, trust that you are the same as them, and that everything that you need to know about trusting how you can make a difference with others is going to come from you. So really value everything that's there, and then at the same time be willing to let it go so that you can listen and be there for other people without thinking that you need to try to do something.
A great discussion. Thanks again, Kylie. For the listeners, that was Kylie Fitzpatrick joining us on Talking Leadership today.